Henry Ford did not invent the assembly line. Ransom Olds was running one in 1901, and Chicago's packing houses had been running the same idea backwards on animals for decades before that. What Ford built was stranger and harder, and it worked so completely that on the 26th of May, 1927, it destroyed him. Set that aside for a minute, because the story you already carry is a good story, and most of it is true. Highland Park, Michigan, 1913. A rope and a winch drag a bare chassis past a row of men, and each man does one thing to it as it goes by. Work that had taken 12.5 hours starts taking 93 minutes. The price of the car falls, and keeps falling $850 at launch, under $300 by the middle of the 20s, until a machine that had been a rich man's amusement is standing in the dirt outside a farmhouse in Nebraska. A country gets put on wheels by a conveyor belt. It is one of the cleanest cause and effect stories industrial history has. Every fact in it checks out. You could take any claim in that paragraph to an archive and confirm it. And it is the wrong explanation. May the 26th, 1927. Mass production was never a supply story. It was a demand story that happened to have a conveyor belt in it. You cannot produce at that scale until you have first manufactured a customer who can afford the output. That reads like a slogan until you sit down with the arithmetic. A factory that can build 2 million cars a year has not solved a problem, it has created one. And the problem is 2 million people with the money to buy a car. Every dollar you strip out of the manufacturing cost has to find a wallet on the other end. If it doesn't, the saving is worthless. It piles up behind the plant as unsold inventory and takes the company down faster than inefficiency ever would. So the binding constraint was never how fast you could make the thing. It was how many people could pay for it. And that number is not a fact of nature, it can be built. Building it is the part that never makes it into the schoolbook version, being far less photogenic than a moving belt. There are 3 ways to do it, and the 20th century tried all 3, in order. You can raise what people earn. You can lend them the gap between what they earn and what the thing costs. Or you can change the arithmetic of production itself, so that the thing stops needing a mass market in order to be cheap. Ford stumbled into the first one sideways, while trying to solve a completely unrelated problem. General Motors built the second one deliberately and took the market with it. Toyota, 30 years later, went after the third, and in doing so, attacked an assumption that Ford, General Motors, and every economist watching them had treated as a law of nature. What follows is how those 3 lock together, and why the company furthest down the road was the one least able to turn. Somebody has to be able to afford it. In 1905, a car was assembled roughly the way furniture is assembled. Parts arrived approximately right, and a skilled fitter made them exactly right. Filing, shimming, scraping metal until this crankcase mated to this crankshaft. The parts were not interchangeable. They were married. That is why a car cost what a small house cost, and why the men who built them were craftsmen with a trade they could carry anywhere. A moving belt cannot exist in that world. You cannot drag a chassis past 100 men if any one of them might need 40 minutes with a file. A moving line requires every part to fit the first time. Every time. Without judgment, a metallurgy and machine tool problem, not a conveyor problem. That is what Ford's people solved. Gauges, tolerances, hardened jigs, single-purpose machines that turned out the same part to the same dimension 10,000 times without a skilled hand touching it. Interchangeability came first. The belt was the consequence. And the belt itself was not new. Olds had a line running in Lansing in 1901 and pushed output from 425 cars a year to 2,500 inside 12 months. The flour mills and canneries had continuous flow. Chicago and Cincinnati had been running the idea in reverse for a generation, carcasses on hooks, moving past men who each removed one piece. The concept was ambient. Detroit was full of people who had seen it work. What Ford did that nobody else did was hold the product still. One model, one chassis. Effectively one process, refined and refined and refined into the same shape. In October 1913, the moving chassis line went in at Highland Park, and the 12.5 hours it took to assemble a Model T came down, inside a year, to 93 minutes. Output went from 10,660 cars in 1909 to just over 2 million in 1923. The price went the other way, $850 at launch, $260 by 1924. Costs of that kind do not fall because time passes, or because the engineers are clever. They fall as a function of how many units you have already built. Every repetition turns up a small improvement. A fixture moved 6 inches, a step deleted, a tolerance relaxed where it turns out not to matter, and those improvements accumulate in the tooling and in the hands. An aircraft engineer named T.P. Wright put numbers on this in 1936, long after Ford was finished with it. Every doubling of cumulative output cut the labor per unit by roughly 20%. Nobody had drawn that curve in 1913. Ford was riding it without a name for it. And the curve has a property that matters more than the number. Cumulative output is not for sale. A competitor with more capital and identical machines still has to build the units, one at a time, to arrive where you already are. Ford's advantage was never the factory floor. Thousands toured it. It was the millions of cars already behind him, and those could not be bought. Anyone in Detroit in 1908, looking at that market with those parts, would have built exactly this machine. In its cold way, it was magnificent, and it ran for 19 years. Follow one man through the door. He arrives at the employment office at Highland Park in 1913, a farm boy out of Michigan, or a man off a boat with 40 words of English, and he is hired because Ford is always hiring. He has walked onto the floor, put at a station, and shown one motion. Fit this bracket, tighten 2 nuts. The chassis arrives every 90 seconds, whether he is ready for it or not. He lasts a few weeks. So does the man who replaces him. So does the man after that. In 1913, the Ford Motor Company hired 50,448 men. Its average workforce that year was 13,623. Let that land. To keep 13,000 men standing on the floor, Ford had to pull 50,000 through the door. And on any given morning, roughly 1 in 10 of the men who did still work there simply did not come in. The headline figure is a turnover rate of 370%. The number underneath it is worse. And it is worse because of the belt. On a craft floor, a man who quits costs you a man. You are short one fitter. You hire another. The shop absorbs it. On a synchronized line, there is no absorbing. The line runs at the speed of its slowest station. And the slowest station is always whichever one has the new man on it. A single untrained pair of hands does not slow one job down. It sets the tempo for everybody downstream of it. Multiply that by 50,000 arrivals, each learning his 90 seconds while the building waits. Then add the surplus of bodies you carry every morning to plug the holes left by the men who didn't show. None of it appeared as a line item. It appeared as a factory that could theoretically build a car in 93 minutes, and, most days, did not. The most efficient production system on Earth was throttled by the fact that almost nobody wanted to work inside it. On the 5th of January, 1914, Ford announced that minimum pay at his plants would be $5 for an 8-hour day, beginning the following Monday. The rate it replaced was $2.34 for 9 hours. He more than doubled the wage, shortened the day, and announced it to the newspapers before he announced it to the men. The press could not decide whether it was philanthropy or insanity. Other manufacturers were furious, some publicly. The effect inside the plant was immediate and enormous. Turnover fell from 370% to 54% in 1914, and to 16% the year after that. Economists have gone back through the payroll records more than once. The most careful reconstruction, Raff and Summers, working through Ford's own numbers, landed where the plant floor already had. The $5 day is a near textbook case of a firm paying above the going rate, because a stable workforce was worth more than the extra wage bill cost. Which is to say, it was not a gift, and it was not a stunt. It was the cheapest available way to buy something. Ford could not buy any other way. He bought it, and it worked. Attached to that wage were 3 things, and none of them were priced. The first, the $5 was not really a wage. Roughly half of it was, and the rest was profit sharing, and you had to qualify for it. Ford set up a department, a real department with a staff of about 50 investigators, whose job was to establish whether you deserved it. They came to your house without warning. They spoke to your neighbors. They looked at what was in your kitchen, asked what you did with your money, whether you drank, whether you gambled, how you kept your rooms. They graded you on a 4-point scale, and only the top 2 grades qualified. You also had to be over 22 and to have 6 months in. Men were disqualified in large numbers. So the price of the highest industrial wage in America was that your private life entered the production process and was inspected like a bearing surface. That layer, at least, a man could refuse. Take the old rate somewhere else. The second is harder to walk away from, because by then, it had already happened to him. The skill that used to live in the fitter's hands now lived in the jig. That was the whole point. It is what made interchangeability possible, and interchangeability is what made the car cheap. But it means the thing a man could once carry out of a building and sell in another town had been permanently taken out of him and installed in the tooling. A fitter had a trade. A man with one motion has an employer, which is also, precisely, why $5 worked so well. It worked because there was nothing else holding him in the building, and there was nothing else holding him in the building because the job had been designed that way. Both of those sentences are true at once. So is a third one. For the men who qualified, that money was a real and substantial improvement in their lives, and they knew it, and they queued around the block for it. The third layer is the one nobody could leave. On a line, you do not set your own pace. The line sets it, and the line's pace is a decision taken somewhere you are not standing. There is no purchase order for speeding up a belt. It does not show up as an expense, or an investment, or a policy, or a memo. It shows up in bodies, over years, and it is recorded nowhere as a cost of the car. And unlike the first two, this one did not belong to Ford. It was not a company practice. It was a property of synchronized work itself, and it went wherever the technique went, into every plant, in every industry that took the technique up. A man could leave the Ford Motor Company. The method was already everywhere else. Somebody has to be able to afford it. By the middle of the 1920s, they could. That turned out to be the problem. The Model T had done exactly what it was built to do. It put a car within reach of a schoolteacher and a farmer, and it did not break. Which meant the man who bought one in 1919 was not in the market in 1925. He had a car. It still ran. Ford's own product had removed him from the pool of buyers, and there were only so many first-time buyers left to replace him. The T also had one competitor Ford could never underprice. The T, a car that lasts, becomes a growing second-hand supply of itself, sitting underneath the new one on price. So the next sale was never going to be to somebody who needed a car. It was to somebody who already had one and wanted a different one. A different transaction entirely. Need can be won on price. Want cannot. Alfred Sloan took over General Motors in 1923 and built a company aimed at exactly that transaction. He did not try to beat Ford on cost. General Motors never beat Ford on cost that was not on the table. What he did instead was change what the price meant. 3 moves. The first was the latter. A car for every purse and purpose. As the 1925 advertisement put it. You started in a Chevrolet, and as your income rose, you moved up through Oldsmobile and Buick toward a Cadillac, and every rung was still a General Motors car. The second was the annual model change. Your car was no longer either working or broken. It was this year's or last year's, and everybody on your street could tell which. The third move did the actual damage, and it was not a car at all. In 1919, General Motors set up a finance company of its own GMAC to lend buyers the money to buy General Motors products. Put down a third or so. Pay off the rest across the following year. Ford was not so much opposed to this as temperamentally offended by it. He thought a man ought to save up first. By 1925, roughly 3/4 of new cars in America were being bought on credit. Set that against Ford's strategy. His machine was built to win one contest. Who can put the lowest cash price on a car? Consumer credit did not win that contest. It ended it. A $700 Chevrolet at $30 a month beats a $290 Ford paid in cash for the very large number of Americans who did not have $290. The question in the showroom stopped being which car is cheapest and became which car can I make the payment on. Ford could see all of this. The registration figures were public. The advertisements were in every magazine, and his own executives were reading them and saying so out loud. So why not simply build a different car? Because by 1926, the car and the machine had become the same object. Sit where Ford was sitting. The cost advantage everyone talks about was never in the buildings and never in the belt. It came off the curve, and the curve only pays out on cumulative units of one thing. Every gauge, every fixture, every single-purpose machine, every man's 90 seconds had been cut to fit one design. That specificity is the cheapness. A flexible factory has no curve. It starts over. Which means the advantage and the trap are not two facts about Ford. They are one fact, read from either end. What made the Model T the cheapest car in the world was that it never changed. What killed the Model T was that it never changed. Every unit built made the next unit cheaper and made the design more expensive to abandon at the same moment, by the same mechanism, in the same ledger entry. By 1926, Ford was sitting on 15 million units of accumulated advantage, which is the identical sentence as 15 million units of accumulated commitment. A learning curve is not a discount you have earned and can spend on anything. It is a deposit, and it is redeemable in exactly one currency, more of the same. So the choice in front of him was never build a different car. It was destroy the machine and build a second machine, because the tooling could not be argued into making anything the T did not already have. The better his position got, the more total the only available move became. And that is why the trap is invisible from inside. It does not announce itself as risk. It presents as the strongest cost position in the industry, quarter after quarter, right to the end. General Motors was never offered that choice, for a distinctly unflattering reason. GM could change every year because GM had never got far enough down the curve to be stuck to anything. Its flexibility was paid for with a permanently higher cost per car. It was worse at manufacturing. That is exactly why it could move. Somebody has to be able to afford it, and General Motors had found the loose thread in that sentence. Nobody has to be able to afford it. They only have to be able to make the payment. Law number 2. A cost advantage built out of cumulative volume is also a debt denominated in sameness, and it compounds until changing the product costs more than the advantage was ever worth. He held on for another 18 months, and the production figures record what that cost. 1923 was the peak. 2,011,125 cars. 1926, 1,730,514. The first 5 months of 1,927, 478,558. On the 24th of May, 1,927, Ford announced the Model T was finished. 2 days later, the 15 millionth one came off the line, with Henry and Edsel Ford sitting in it for the photographers. And then the plant stopped. Not slowed, stopped. The first shutdown in the company's history, and there was nobody to blame for it except the decision itself. No strike, no fire, no bank. The tooling that had made the T was largely single-purpose, which is another way of saying it became worthless on the day the T ended. Fixtures had to come out of the floor. Machines had to be rebuilt or scrapped. Men were laid off in enormous numbers in a city whose entire economy sat downstream of that one company. And through all of it, the engine plant kept running. Ford went on building Model T engines while the rest of the operation was being torn out, spares for 15 million cars already on the roads. For months, the company was manufacturing parts for a product it had just abolished, one building over from the machine being dismantled. Ford's dealers, thousands of franchises, businesses built on holding the cheapest car in America, spent the better part of a year with nothing to sell. Some switched to other makes. Most got through it servicing Model Ts they could no longer replace and trading in used ones, which is a thin living for a dealership built on volume. Chevrolet sold more than 1 million cars in 1927 and took first place in the American market for the first time. It won that year partly on merit, and partly because for most of it, its main competitor was not in the market at all. Then, in 1928, the Model A arrived, and Ford took first place straight back. That is the part that is easy to skim past. The Model A proved Ford could still build the best cheap car in the world. He had lost nothing, not the engineers, not the plant, not the suppliers, not the name. Everything that made him formidable was still sitting there in Michigan. What he had to do in order to use any of it was demolish the machine that had proved it in the first place. 19 years to build it, 6 months to take it down. They knew. That is what keeps this from being a story about one stubborn man. In January 1926, 18 months before the shutdown, a Ford vice president named Ernest Kanzler wrote Henry Ford an 8-page memorandum setting out, in order, more or less everything you have just heard. The market was changing. The T could not be updated into what buyers now wanted. The replacement had to start immediately. Kanzler was Edsel Ford's brother-in-law. Edsel agreed with him. So did much of the executive floor. Ford froze him out, and he was gone within months. It is tempting to stop there, on the stubbornness. That ending is popular, and it explains almost nothing. It cannot explain why the people who agreed with Kanzler could not move either. Every number that measured the machine said the machine was fine. Ford's costs in 1926 were still the lowest in the industry. The thing that was killing the company did not appear in cost accounting, or in unit output, or in any figure the business generated about itself. It appeared in what buyers were choosing, and it arrived slowly enough to read as noise. Kanzler was not presenting evidence. He was presenting an argument about the shape of a curve, and you cannot see the shape of a curve from inside it. He was right, and at the time he was unprovable, and Ford did try the small version first. Through 1926, the T got new colors, a restyled and lowered body. a longer list of things it had never had. That is the rational move. Improve at the margin, protect the cost position, do not bet the company on a guess. It did not work, and the reason it did not work is the trap itself. Incremental change was the one thing the tooling would allow and the one thing the market had stopped rewarding. There was also no way to test the alternative. You cannot half-stop a synchronized factory. There was no pilot, no second line, no quarter you could run as an experiment. The only available move was total, and total meant a year with no revenue and idle men in Detroit. And a man who did everything right lost anyway. The Ford dealer in 1926 had built a business on the most defensible product in America, cheapest, most reliable, most parts in the ground, best-known name on earth. He made no bad bet. He misread nothing. He spent 1,927 sweeping an empty showroom. Take the law out of the century it happened in. Any advantage that accrues from repetition is also a rising bill for the right to do something else. Strength and rigidity are not two properties. They are one measurement, read from opposite ends. You can watch the same law run backwards, which is how you know it is a law and not an anecdote. In 1950, Toyota was caught in the same trap from the other side. Changing the dies on a stamping press took between 2 and 8 hours, and the accepted arithmetic said that if changeovers are expensive, you run enormous batches to spread the cost. Big lots are cheap. That was not an opinion. It was the standard formula, taught everywhere. Toyota could afford neither the lots nor the downtime, so Shigeo Shingo went after the changeover itself and drove it under 10 minutes. Nobody ever refuted the claim that big batches are cheaper. They removed the reason it was true. That is the only exit. You do not outrun a curve like Ford's. You dismantle the assumption holding it up. The same trade is running right now in every business where cost per unit falls with cumulative volume cells, chips, launch vehicles, anything where being early and enormous is the whole moat. The moat is real. The moat is also a wager, renewed every quarter, that nobody will want a different shape of thing. Ford's machine was among the most extraordinary objects human beings have built, and it ended because of the exact property that made it extraordinary. Both are true. Neither cancels the other. The moving line only decided how fast the cars came out. What changed the century was slower and much harder to photograph. The discovery that the man being paid and the man being sold to had to be the same man. Ford found half of that by accident, trying to keep his line staffed. General Motors found the other half on purpose. And when the man still could not afford it, they did not raise his wage. They lent him the difference.